Hey everyone, Sean here from the China Culture Corner. Today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the proposed Restrict Act from the USA, which is designed to ban or block technology companies from China and other so-called foreign adversaries. So today we'll be talking about how I think this is going to backfire and harm the USA, not just the government, but industry sectors, companies, and consumers as well. All right, let's get into it. Now, over the past decade, there have been a number of concerns raised about Chinese technology firms operating in the USA and the potential impact they could have on US national security. For example, telecommunications equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE have been banned or blocked from being used by local US operators. Also, a move by Huawei to sell its smartphones through local US carriers was blocked at the last minute in a move that many saw as a result of government pressure. Global drone maker DJI cannot have its products used by the US military services, and strangely enough, in some cases by fire and rescue services. Lastly, many of you have probably heard about TikTok, which is parent company is Chinese, ByteDance, and how they may be banned or blocked in the USA, or they may be forced to be sold to a US entity. The proposed Restrict Act looks to continue these blocks and bans on Chinese companies. But does this act come from a legitimate national security concern, or does it result more from xenophobia, xenophobia against foreign companies overseas, and the desire to protect the USA, its industries, and companies from competitive overseas companies? To find out, let's head back to the studio. We'll all share more about the proposed Restrict Act, how it could backfire and hurt more than help the USA, and how I suggest we focus on collaborating with China and Chinese companies in the future. What exactly is the Restrict Act? The act was first introduced by US Senator Mark Warner, and it aims to empower the executive branch to block transactions and holdings of foreign adversaries that involve information communication technology, or ICT, that pose an undue or unacceptable risk to US national security. Now, you may be asking, what exactly is a foreign adversary? Well, under the proposed Restrict Act, there are 6 countries currently listed, though that list can be amended in the future if the act passes. The list currently includes China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. The proposed Restrict Act is also very broad in its powers. It would make it hard for the general public to understand what actions are being taken under it, and it would make it very easy for any company or entity from one of the proposed foreign adversaries to be deemed a threat to national security without any real clear evidence being provided. Now, as a viewer, you may be asking, well, this has to do with companies, this has to do with governments. Why should I care? How is this going to affect me? All right, let's move on to that. Additional fear and xenophobia is going to make America appear like a much less welcoming place. We've always touted ourselves as being the mixing pot, the place where people could come to be free, but we are very racist in how we approach certain countries, not just the countries, but their companies, their people, etc., as we've seen time and time again with China in this case. Now, it's important to understand that if we continue passing legislation like this, there are going to be less companies that are willing to come and invest in the United States if they don't know when they may be targeted as a threat to national security at any time without any evidence. And it's going to not just make companies more hesitant, but it's also going to make high-skilled workers, like those that work in Silicon Valley. Right now, a significant portion come from China, come from India. They don't necessarily come from traditional, Americans. There's going to be another spillover into less students wanting to come, less business people wanting to come. So if we lose a lot of that talent, a lot of that investment capital that's coming from overseas, our country, America, becomes weaker because of that. Second, another key negative result of the proposed Restrict Act is removing consumers' choice. Now, what this goes back to is what I've said earlier in other videos about, I very strongly believe that these companies have only had actions taken against them after they've become successful, after they have been able to offer products and services that can either compete at the same level as American brands or surpass them. Now, we saw in the case of Huawei and telecommunications equipment, it was actually higher quality and cheaper in many cases, and it was very preferred by smaller telecom operators. We see that Huawei and other Chinese brands have made very high quality smartphones, but it's very hard for them to sell in the United States right now. And that means that US consumers have one less option, especially a very high quality and innovative option to pick from. And so this means that the US consumers, they have to either pay more for the same quality or they don't get as high quality as they could get. So if we continue to ban companies that are more competitive than our own, the consumer loses out. They have to pay more or they have less disposable income to spend on other things. Third, a related topic is that I feel in the longer run, US industry and US companies are going to lose out. Now, you may ask, if we're preventing these Chinese competitors from coming into the market, how will US companies and US industries lose out? Well, it's important to understand that through my working with Chinese companies, yes, there are not the same level of innovation and expertise in all companies and all industries in China, but I've seen a lot of scientific and technical expertise. I've seen lots of innovation. And if we remove this strong competitive element from being able to come to the United States, then that means that China is going to be taking their competitive, innovative companies and products to other countries. These countries are going to be learning. They're going to be having to react to these more competitive, more innovative products and companies. And if they want to continue to compete, to survive in those industries, they're going to have to adapt. If the US has protectionism in place, if they're preventing these companies from coming, then that means there's not going to be any external pressure on US companies, on US industries to continue to improve. So I see, if we're looking at China already looking to become bigger in terms of GDP, bigger than the USA in terms of other areas, if we remove the pressure for us to continue to improve, then we're going to fall farther behind China. And China is going to have an even bigger advantage. Now again, I love China, but I also love the United States. That's my home country. And I strongly feel that the pressure a competitive China that's allowed to do business in the United States can have a very strong positive impact on the US, driving the USA to further improve. And if we remove that, we will lose in the long run, in my opinion. Now that we've talked about the key dangers I see from the proposed Restrict Act and other similar legislation that target China and other foreign adversaries, let's talk about how we should think about working and collaborating with companies from overseas, specifically in this case, companies from China, especially in the technology sector. Now, there's 2 points I do want to mention. First, national security is a valid concern. Countries spy on each other. Countries steal technology from each other. China does it to the US, I'm sure, and I'm sure the United States does it to other countries. We know from many leaks the United States spies not just on its adversaries, but also on its allies as well. Second, Chinese companies do bad things. They do not follow the law sometimes. They do maybe have problems in terms of the actions they take. We know that ByteDance was tracking journalists when they shouldn't have, and that was a very stupid move. So these things do happen, but acknowledging that they happen, it's also at the same time important to understand that there's not going to be some shadowy connection to the CPC, the Communist Party of China. That's something we need to get out of our heads. Companies, whether they're American, whether they're Chinese, companies do things that maybe break the law or that deserve fines. They don't follow regulations. It happens. It doesn't mean there's some conspiracy going on. But that being said, it's important to understand that even if we follow a more proactive way to have a relationship with China and Chinese companies, it is rational to have certain safeguards in place. So, but at the same time, I feel that if we take the easy way out, if we simply are afraid of something and ban it, we lose any potential advantages we could get. So I would say when it comes to companies, having companies here, I think it is incumbent upon us, upon America, to have more regulation in place. We've seen TikTok, the social media company, criticized because it is collecting data on US consumers. Or we've seen them criticized for, being able to track certain people or being able to send certain content. But this is something that US social media companies do as well. And so I would say, if we're concerned about a Chinese company acting this way, why are we not concerned about US companies acting this way? I would say if we want to have a level playing field and a safe playing field for technology in the United States, then let's make sure it's level for all. Because, as I mentioned earlier, according to the proposed Restrict Act, it would be very easy for US companies to lobby the government to block one company for alleged national security reasons, which then leads to all the negative things that I've mentioned earlier, all the negative impacts that could have on America, companies, society. So let's make sure there's a level and clear regulatory environment. And if a company does not comply with regulations, be it a Chinese company or American company, make sure they are punished, make sure they are fined, make sure they are held to account. That will not only protect America, but it will also send a clear signal to Chinese companies in this case that says you are welcome, but you have to observe our local laws. I would also suggest that the US, or at the very least US companies, consider finding ways to have more partnerships, more exchanges with companies, especially successful companies from China. Because one of the things we see that is when Chinese companies are maybe operating in the United States, they have some culture shock issues. We see American workers, or even in other countries, Western workers having a hard time working within Chinese environments. But at the same time, it's these type of environments that to some degree have helped these companies succeed. And so if we're not going to be blocking successful Chinese brands like Huawei, DJI, like TikTok, then I would suggest American companies need to put a lot more effort into learning how they succeed. And if there can be more partnerships, if there can be more exchanges, and again, we don't have to have any vital technology exchange. We can have working exchanges. We can have other ways to cooperate. American companies, American workers will be able to better understand these Chinese companies and, in my view, better learn how to compete alongside them in this ever-changing world that is becoming more complex and that China is playing a greater and greater role in. So the more we can get used to that, the more we can acclimatize ourselves to that, the better off America will be moving forward with a more powerful and more competitive China. All right, guys, that's it for today's video. If you're interested in learning more about the Restrict Act, I'll leave a few links in the description for your reference. I'd also hope you take a look at a petition to stop the Restrict Act from being passed, and in doing so, harm our country and company. I'll leave a link to that as well, too. If you're interested in learning more about China, Chinese technology, working and living in China, and how China impacts our world today and in the future, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on social media. You can find me at SeanUM_China. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time.